So it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome Frida Polli, founder and CEO of Pymetrics, to ESG Square to talk a bit about her story, the story behind Pymetrics and how it helps on the S part of the ESG. But Frida, perhaps instead of me doing an introduction, how about I hand that over to you?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much, Nick. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I'm Frida Polli. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Pymetrics. Pymetrics is a company that uses soft skills and fairness optimized artificial intelligence to make hiring both more accurate and more fair. And prior to starting Pymetrics, I was an academic neuroscientist at Harvard and MIT for 10 years. So a lot of the science that we developed in academia is what we are leveraging for the company. So it's a pleasure to be here to talk about how fairness optimized artificial intelligence and soft skills can really be helpful when thinking about the S part in things that are critical, like hiring, mobility, reskilling, and other aspects of workforce development.
Super. And before people start wondering how many blonde-haired, blue-eyed Italians there are with the last name Polli, we are indeed brother and sister. So we can get that out of the way. So Frida, maybe can you tell us a little bit about Pymetrics and how it works and what the proposition is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, I think the best place to start is really just the founding story. So, I was an academic scientist for 10 years, was really excited by the new science we were bringing to bear on the problem of understanding people better, but was frustrated by the fact that it didn't have any real world application. So I went to business school at Harvard to figure out what is a real world problem that the science could be applied to. And that's where I saw recruiting firsthand. I mean, you went to business school as well. That's what business school students do, is recruit. And what was obvious was that people wanted to know more about who someone really was, their soft skills, their cognitive, social, and emotional makeup, like what makes them human, not so much what was on a resume, which was quite evident. So that was one piece of the puzzle that, our science could help with. And then the second thing was that there really wasn't any kind of sort of data-driven analysis going on. It was very sort of, anecdotal and coffee chats and things that weren't super scientific. So what we brought to bear on the problem was, again, understanding someone more holistically from, a soft skill perspective, as well as, artificial intelligence to help with the matching. And the other very important piece that I thought it solved for was removing the bias from the equation. Because again, so here I went to business school. As you know, at the time, I was a single parent. I was in my mid-30s. I didn't look like, a tech entrepreneur. And so even my own story led me to understand that, people have their own biases when, selecting folks for different roles. And the human brain is unfortunately hardwired with these biases, yet we can build technology that doesn't need to bake them in. And so that was another critical component for me, was making that process not only more accurate, but free of unconscious bias that comes from human decision-making, that is present in all human decision-making. That was a very fundamental reason for why I wanted to start the company.
Super. And I mean, talking about bias, you mentioned the human bias, but I think there's even a bias in the process, because we've talked about this, obviously. The resume, when you screen and as someone hiring people, we do what we think is normal. You go to the best schools, you look for the best grades, you look for the extra curriculum. But within that, there's clearly a bias towards socioeconomic indicators, potentially race indicators, and other things like that.
Yeah.
How does Pymetrics, sorry.
No, go ahead. How does Pymetrics solve for that? I mean, so I think that, so two parts to that, answering that question in two parts. So one, you're absolutely right in what you said. And it's even worse than that. So they did a meta-analysis of 30 years of resume review decision-making by humans, right? And the way they audit that process is they submit the same exact resume to a firm, but, in one case, the name is John Williams, who's a white male candidate. And in another case, if you want to study gender, it's Jane Williams. And if you want to study race, it's Jamal Williams. And, what's unfortunate is that over the last 30 years, and this meta-analysis was just completed a few years ago, there has been basically no change in discrimination against people of color. So for every 10 interviews John gets, Jamal, the African-American sounding candidate, gets 7. And this is with the exact same resume, right? So this is clearly biased, right? Not like, they're not as qualified. And Juan Williams gets 8. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's where the unconscious bias comes in, that we as humans, you have it, I have it. We cannot avoid it. It's hardwired into our brains, right? So that's one aspect. If you use a tech enabled process or tech optimized process, you can eliminate. Now, to your question, how do you avoid those biases from then also being mirrored by technology? The way you can do that is twofold. One is that you can start with a data set that is largely unbiased. So when you talk about socioeconomic indicators, unfortunately, oftentimes our resumes mirror our socioeconomic experience, right? So for all the ways that you can imagine. So soft skills, what we use is a type of data that is far less biased. So basically, men and women, people of different ethnic backgrounds have much, much more similar soft skill profiles than they do resumes. Does that make sense? Because it sort of eliminates, because it's more about who you are fundamentally as a person, which is much more equal than potentially your socioeconomic experience. So that's one thing, is start with less biased data. And the second thing that we do is we test all of our algorithms for statistical parity. So if you are recommending people at equal rates, your ratio should be as close as possible to 1. And that's what we optimize for, is having our gender ratio and our racial ratios as close as possible to statistical parity, which is 1.
You use the term soft skills quite a bit. What is a soft skill and versus a hard skill? Could you just help define that?
Sure. So a soft skill is essentially something that is more fundamental about a person that they are born with, right? So your memory, your attention, your altruism, your, things like that are things that are all present in all human beings, right? And that are not necessarily things that you learn, right? They're not acquired is the way that, it doesn't mean they can't change over time, but generally not, they're thought to be more innate, less acquired, and present in everyone. A hard skill is something like, can you, model in Excel, or are you able to code in Java, or, things that are more acquired. That's generally speaking how people differentiate between hard and soft skills. And what I learned at HBS was that, the hard skills, it's easy. You just look at a resume, you know what their hard skills are, right? It's the soft skills that are much harder. It's like, is this person a team player? Under what conditions are they motivated? And it was those types of things that recruiters were trying to figure out and couldn't really quite do it. And they were using what I call resume tea leaf reading, which is, this person played team sports, so they must be a team player, or, things of that nature. Or they had a side job, they must be a hard worker. I mean, as opposed to just measuring them directly. So I think that's what's much harder to measure in people and also very critical in a person's success. I mean, you can have all the hard skill requirements, and as you, I'm sure, are well aware, you can be a bad soft skill fit, and that's very critical for role success.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just because you've done the role or you've done it doesn't necessarily mean that you were good at it, or that you enjoyed it, or that, you should be doing it again.
And not only that, but roles are different, right? I mean, we work with many financial service, companies, and, private wealth might be quite different at one bank versus another, right? Or, there are lots of different nuances that just because I think values at different firms are quite different, right? I mean, if you take, I don't know, Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, you might think that, different people might be, successful there versus an HSBC. So my point is, all of that stuff is what we measure and are able to quantify. And
back to the algorithms just for a second. There's a lot of stuff around algorithms nowadays being a bit of a black box. So if you do have, that bias in it, how do you really tweak it out? Now you've talked a bit about it, but
yep.
Is an algorithm, does it help? I mean, is it transparent and you can really audit it and understand what's going on?
Yeah. So look
that a bit.
Yeah. So there are different types of algorithms, some being more explainable than others. And actually the EU is sort of leading the way. I don't know if you're following some of the regulation coming out of the EU, but they are going to require explainability and other things like that for what are called high-risk situations like hiring, which we think is a great idea. And we already do that. But even the most opaque algorithm, like a neural net algorithm, can still be quite auditable in its output, right? I mean, it's like a car, right? I don't need to understand exactly how the engine works in order to do an emissions test, right? And it's the same with an algorithm, right? You can still do the emissions test. You can still look at the output. That is always going to be present. Unlike the human brain, as I mentioned to you earlier, does not leave a trail of its decisions that you can audit as easily.
Super. Can you maybe just moving on to a practical example? Like
Sure.
how have you improved diversity inclusion
Yeah.
with, a case study firm?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so we work with a, vast number of, large companies, including a lot in financial services. And, we've been able to, and, a lot of this is out there in the public domain. I mean, we've been able to help, Fortune 100 financial service companies in the US and also abroad, with both gender and racial equality. I mean, Blackstone is a great example of this. They really have done a tremendous job, in the private equity space, which is hard, increasing gender representation, and, give us credit for some of that. And then we have another, Fortune 100 bank that, same thing, was recently in the news for increasing racial diversity, and also credited their use of pymetrics. So, and again, depending on how bad the situation is to begin with, we see small increases like 10% all the way to, if your situation is, again, if there's more room to grow, then can be 100% increase in sort of gender and ethnic diversity. And it's really just dependent on, I think, again, how homogenous the workforce is to begin with. But again, I don't think companies should be, companies should be lauded for any efforts they're making, regardless of where their starting point is, right? It's like somebody who wants to lose weight. Are you going to make fun of them because, they're overweight? No, you're going to say that's wonderful that you are taking these steps forward, and we applaud you no matter where your starting point is. So.
Yeah. And the good thing is, when you talked about diversity, you've been talking about gender, about race, but presumably also socioeconomic, culture, geographic, everything.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the wonderful thing about, something that focuses on soft skills. To your point, thank you for reminding me, it's such an important area of diversity. I mean, socioeconomic diversity is critical, right? Because you see this now in the US and other places, right? That just because you are Caucasian does not mean that you are advantaged, right? In terms of your socioeconomic, sort of socioeconomic status. And so I think it's really critical that we remove all types of biases, gender biases, racial and ethnic biases, as well as socioeconomic biases, because I think, again, I think people more and more now are acknowledging that, having a college degree is not as essential. And again, I think Europe has always been quite forward thinking on this, right? I mean, Germany, Switzerland, they have, very strong apprenticeship type programs. And I think that's critical, because I think we have to move away from this idea that, credentialing is so critical if we want to really address some of these socioeconomic challenges that, society faces. So thank you for reminding me of that.
Yeah, super. Well, look, that's been awesome. And thank you for taking us through a quick drive of pymetrics and what you're doing to help the social and inclusivity agenda. Do you have any last sort of key messages for our audience here that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key message I would have is really that I think a lot of people feel like diversity and inclusion is so overwhelming that they don't know where to start, and I think that there's some very basic things that one can do. So one can have goals and accountability. You can have tracking metrics, having transparent processes, and using technology. All of those things have been shown by research to improve diversity and inclusion. And wherever you are in the process, start somewhere. Again, it's a bit like losing weight, right? Don't think, oh my goodness, I have to get here. Just be like, you know what? Tomorrow I'm going to do something differently. And that's the message that I would leave people with, is that it's very achievable. With thinking about metrics, processes, accountability, transparency, and then the use of technology as well.
Super. So just get started, basically, and every little bit helps.
Exactly. Yeah. Get started, and also just realize that, like with any other business process, right? If you were going to spend less money, you would have goals, you would have metrics, you would have transparency. I mean, just basic things can help with diversity and inclusion as well. And I think sometimes we sort of think it has to be much more complicated, but it doesn't need to be.
Super. Frida, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Nick.
All right.
Okay. Bye.